Welcome back, everyone. This is Chase with another episode of our History of Gear series. And again, joined with me today is Bruce Johnson, a gear historian and creator of the History of Gear project, joining me virtually again. Thanks for joining. Excited today to talk a little bit about the company Gerry and the influence of that company on the industry that we know today. So thanks for joining.
Sure, I'd love to talk about this. I do have a little bit of a preface about the whole scene around the company Gerry, which carried a few different names. Gerry Mountain Sports encapsulated it a little better than just Gerry. But in the history of gear, there were some real pioneers, and Gerry was among them. And in 1992, the Outdoor Retailers group, which has been around for many years and still is, put together a special edition, you might say, in Reno, where they usually met, and they brought in what they felt were the 12 greatest gear pioneers. They called them pioneers of the industry. And there were 12 of them that they identified, and that was in 92. So it's interesting to go through these names. There's Gerry Cunningham and his wife Ann, Alice and Roy Hollybar, Mr. L.L. Bean, Jack Stevenson of Warmlight, Lloyd Anderson, REI founder, George Rudolph, Ski Hut and Trailwise, Dick Kelty of Kelty Packs, Colin Fletcher, who popularized backpacking, Eddie Bauer, Jim Whitaker, Everest climber, Al Steck, Ski Hut designer and climber. And the selection there is pretty broad, and there's names there that modern people listening to this probably aren't very familiar with. But in future podcasts, we'll cover a number of these. So I just wanted to put that in there, that Gerry Cunningham was identified by Outdoor Retailers as one of the 12 great pioneers in the industry.
It's nice to know that the industry at that time spent the time to recognize those individuals, with Gerry and Ann Cunningham included in that list. It's just nice to know that they've gotten the appreciation that they deserve in that respect, given that title. They
were flown out to Reno and wined and dined. Gerry told me the whole story.
And we'll get into that a little bit. That was probably one of the last times that he was really involved with the brand itself. He wasn't working for the company at that time. But it seems like that was kind of one of the last times that he was really tied back to the company in that kind of a formal way. But
yes, yeah, that's true.
Well, can we go back to the beginning a little bit? I think that's a nice bookend, right? To kind of see where he ended up, he and his wife Ann, kind of the recognition that they deserved. How did it all start? Where did Gerry and Ann grow up, and where did this love of the outdoors come from for them? What was the era and the time period that they were growing up in?
They were in upstate New York, and upstate New York was maybe one of the very first seed beds in the U.S. for downhill skiing. The area gets a lot of snow, as you might know. And Gerry was involved. He was just interested in that subject, skiing, and he did a little himself. He designed ski skins out of like carpet and would sell them to skiers who were trying to get up and down the slopes on these 6-foot-long wooden skis. So why did he do that? Well, he was in an area that was more of a outdoor area with some mountains, and he liked being outdoors, right? his father was a studio photographer who actually invented some early machines that created photographs like the modern, machines you can plug your thumb drive into. And so Gerry learned photography, but he also learned at his mother's knee sewing and got good at that, which then led him to designing a pack in 1938 when he was still in high school. And his concept was to compartmentalize the load against the back so it didn't turn into just a kidney buster. It was a little pack that was a teardrop design and became, of course, extremely popular and ripped off by everybody throughout the next several decades. The whole progress that he might have started his own little company or something in 1939 or 40 got interrupted by World War II when he got drafted. And so he went into the service and got himself into the 10th Mountain Division, which was partly based on the fact he already was familiar with skiing and had grown up in a snowy type climate. So what most people don't realize, he was a conscientious objector, so he ended up as a medic in Italy. And throughout the war, he'll tell stories of how he would lie in his sleeping bag cursing the terrible gear and dreaming of better gear, and had in his mind his company logo. He was going to start a company. He's going to have to wait till after the war. But he dreamed of a logo that had his name written on the bottom and a mountain in the background shaped like that. And interestingly, when they did finally establish their company in the mountains of Colorado, right out the front door, there was a mountain called Sawtooth in the Rockies that looked just like what he had imagined, this Sawtooth Mountain that he'd always imagined in the background. So that's kind of how he got going.
So kind of going back a little bit, there's a lot there. When he was growing up in New York, it seemed like he was just kind of learning. It was this combination of things kind of came together, this being outside, getting involved in skiing, learning from his mom how to sew. It's just kind of this perfect storm of skills and, these things that help prepare him to become, the creator of an outdoor brand. Was he sketching out that logo at that time when he was deployed? Do you happen to know when was that first sketch of the logo created?
Well, I was told he had sketches, but they got lost by the time he got mustered out.
So he had sketches in New York before he got sent out?
No. What he told me was that he had gotten out of the service and those sketches and notebooks just got lost. So he kind of started from scratch again. But he had it clear in his mind what he wanted to do.
Right.
And so when he got back to the States, he lived with his parents, he and his wife, Ann. And he created, probably on his mother's sewing machine, a whole selection of gear that he felt would be the complete outfit, pack, sleeping bag, etc., that would be used in a catalog that he would then be selling and starting his company. So early in 1946, he had always dreamed of living a self-sufficient life in the mountains. He'd actually been kind of kicked out of his university because of that. His advisor thought he was incredibly unrealistic to think that he could go live in the mountains and make gear. And
where was he going to school at the time?
One of these more upscale universities that's been around for a long time in the Northeast. I'd have to go look for the name right now. It's escaping me. But it's on my website.
We'll refer to that. So anyone who wants to see that can look at the website in the show notes. So really, when he got back from the war, kind of the product lines that he envisioned, eventually building out were really informed by the products he had used up to that point and the conditions that he had faced. These brutal conditions, the 10th Mountain Division being that special force that was trained for winter and mountain battles, right? So he was really, I imagine that kind of informed the products that he wanted to create. He wanted, like you said, he wanted to create that complete product line from, apparel to packs to tents to stoves, eventually to climbing gear. He kind of wanted to do it all. And I imagine that's because of what he faced in the war, right? And the products that he was using there that he saw the deficiencies of.
Yes, and I think it's important to note that the personality of Gerry was always that of a creative, inventive person. I don't think you get to be a gear designer, and especially somebody who then goes on to try to start a whole company, without having that gene almost, that you're creative, you're inventive, that's just who you are.
Yeah, what were the other products at that time that were informing? I guess he had to be using products at that time. Growing up, he was skiing, he was using gear. In the war, he was using military gear at that time, and from what I understand, individuals like LL Bean and Eddie Bauer were educating the military on how to make gear. What types of gear, what types of brands were around at that time that he would have been exposed to? I mean, he wasn't the first outdoor founder, right? Abercrombie and Fitch was around, which people, now probably don't realize was an outdoor company when it started. LL Bean, Eddie Bauer. What were the brands at that time that he would have been interacting with?
Truly there weren't many. Abercrombie and Fitch basically were importers. So there you have the European influence. So at the time, the gear, especially for backpacking and climbing, was really all coming out of Europe.
Right. Well, REI, we know REI really came out of that. Was really born out of that, right? People in the U.S. not having access to good gear, especially climbing equipment. And that's why it's pretty well known that ice axe was the first thing that they brought over from Europe and started buying those and selling them to people in the U.S., right?
Yeah. And the same was true in the Bay Area with the ski hut, which got going in the mid-30s. And basically, they weren't inventing their own gear. They were just importers.
Right.
LL Bean was making stuff that didn't really apply a whole lot to backpacking and climbing, especially not to climbing. Eddie Bauer, of course, with inventing, you might say, the first down jacket kind of thing. It's hard to know whether Gerry has not spoken to me about having influence from any of those companies. So that part's a little bit of a mystery. Gerry, that is, was, as I said, an inventor. So he went his own way, followed his own light.
Well, I imagine companies at that time, it was so regional, right? I mean, it kind of where he was in New York, probably only had access to the companies that were operating in that area, right?
Well, yes. In the early history of gear, it's always important to think about Well, what was going on back then as far as companies being able to communicate with one another or know about each other's products? There was no internet. There were no toll-free phone lines. Uh, there, there was, even in the earliest ages, there was not even television. So it was writing letters, and uh, the very early companies might have a mimeographed catalog maybe on a very small mailing list, but boy, there wasn't much interchange in the very earliest days.
Right. It seems like mail order catalogs were really the thing, right? I mean, we see, well, we just acquired for our archive the earliest Abercrombie and Fitch catalog, and it was 1904 or 1907. I just looked at it today, but so mail order catalogs were kind of the thing at that time, and by the 30s, 40s, I imagine that was one of the predominant ways that people were buying gear.
Yeah. Although as far as actual companies that you would call backpacking or climbing companies, um, there weren't catalogs really until places like Highlander and Gerry started putting out catalogs in the late 40s or early 50s.
Right. So maybe we can get into that a little bit. So he and Anne started to design their own packs, right? And it started with climbing.
They had started with a pack and branched out. By the early 50s, they were creating down sleeping bags, mountaineering tents, and of course, packs. They became the major suppliers to some of the great expeditions of the 1950s, especially 1953 big expedition there to Everest, and this down sleeping bags and so forth were also part of the equipment they supplied, along with Eddie Bauer, of course. But yeah, that's kind of how it happened.
It's interesting. The one thing that I noticed when I was digging into the history a little bit is they cranked out so many products in such a short amount of time, and seemed to achieve a level of success that maybe, when they were in it, maybe it didn't seem like they were having, were blowing up. But just if you look at the timeline, 1945, 1946, they start sending out catalogs. And then by 1959, so in a relatively short amount of time, they have a partnership with the U.S. Air Force. They'd already done, the partnership to help Sir Edmund Hillary and the team on the Mount Everest summit. Really a short amount of time that they had worked on some really meaningful projects and done a lot. And then, throughout that time, a lot of inventions being created. Kind of going back to the beginning, it's interesting. Do you mind telling a little bit how they got their first addresses? I mean, mail orders being the big thing, then they needed addresses, and they needed to send catalogs out. How did that come about? How did they get those first addresses to start sending out catalogs?
Well, they had a connection in the ski industry, and just basically said, would you be willing to send us your mailing list? We have some gear to sell. And lo and behold, they got a list and began sending out catalogs. And it just kind of mushroomed from there. And by the time that they were, let's say, 6-8 years in, they've become well known by a whole lot of prominent mountaineers of the time. And those folks would be dropping by their little shop up in the mountains. And it got to the point by about 1960 that Gerry was frustrated. He couldn't hardly work in his workshop anymore. All these people kept dropping by and interrupting his work. So it's a success story that began with just one guy, really. Anne wasn't the designer. She was extremely supportive and was raising their children, their 3 children up there in the mountains. But
Where
it
was
was
the company based at that time?
Ward, Colorado,
Ward. Okay.
tiny
And
little place up in the mountains up above Boulder.
wow. It's so, after they started sending out those catalogs, there's kind of a time jump, right? From, well, not really. I'm getting ahead of myself. The next year he started working on hard gear. He wasn't satisfied enough to just do bags and soft product. Again, he kind of wanted to do the whole gambit and redesigned the modern Karabiner in 1947. Do you mind
Yeah.
sharing a little bit about that?
Oh, he tells such fun stories about carabiners and pitons that he was designing up there in his little stone workshop up in the mountains. That he'd put in, what did he say, like $5 worth of labor to produce, let's say, a carabiner, and then he'd sell it for $1. He was very interested in mountain safety. He was a climber himself, not a big name climber, but he had the cred, and he knew what he needed and what climbers needed. He just was, I keep saying he's an inventor and an innovator. It's just in his bones.
Did he learn how to climb when he was in the 10th Mountain Division? Was that a part of the training? A lot of these guys had to be skiers and mountaineers. Was that part of the training at that time?
Yeah. He certainly didn't get it in New York.
Right. Okay. And then I was going to ask, this connection with Ski Patrol magazine. Do you happen to know if that was a 10th Mountain Division connection? Because it seemed like a lot of these guys, they came back from the war, founded ski resorts, went on to work for ski magazines, started ski shops. Do you happen to know if that was a connection that he made during that time?
He had plenty of connections to the 10th Mountain, and one of his main business partners became a guy that was also in the 10th Mountain. Now, Camp Hale was the 10th Mountain headquarters in the mountains of Colorado, and his daughter, Penny Cunningham, was writing up a whole series of stuff about Camp Hale. She called it the Camp Hale days, and talking about all the personalities and people in and out of there, and just stories, what happened there. Unfortunately, she met a sort of an untimely end, and all that got lost.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, there was a lot. That was a real seminal thing in the start of the outdoor gear industry, was the 10th Mountain Division, and it having a big base in Colorado, and it led to a lot of Colorado businesses and companies.
Right. Well, we're planning on having a future episode just all about that group because they're so influential to the industry. Kind of going back to the Karabiner design, that really, can you talk about how influential that was? Because if you look at any cheap throwaway Karabiner that you'd see on your backpack, or the giveaway swag carabiners, they're all that design, right? They're all that shape. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, it became the classic shape. There are others, of course, that have been of more modern invention, and some for specialized uses. But that was one of Gerry's things. Now, I cannot leave out Highlander, though,
right?
Which we'll have to get to, because in parallel time, Roy Highlander also had a local blacksmith named Bob Bruning, who was busy creating and hammering out in his shop piton hammers and pitons and carabiners. So there was some real parallel developments going on. But Gerry, clearly he was pretty much the beginner, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less.
When it comes to climbing equipment.
Yeah, and other things like a really good mountain tent.
Mm. So really bringing that performance that maybe he saw was lacking in the military products that he was using, he really focused in on the need for performance.
Yes.
Do you think that's where he got that? Was he saw the deficiencies and realized we need product that performs, because I've been in these harsh environments. And there's people who are going to buy stuff that, if it helps them be a little bit more comfortable in these tough environments.
Yes, he spoke of misery in some of the gear provided there to the 10th Mountain. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've heard the stories of people wearing wool socks, and there's kind of a famous picture of one of the soldiers, having to, I guess just socks being frozen to feet, and some of them having to thaw out their feet in socks, and it just kind of miserable conditions, from what I've heard in my little study. But maybe we can talk about some more of the inventions that he worked on during this time, again in quick succession. From the really the company sending out those first catalogs, 1945, 46. Karabiner designed in 47. Now, did he get a patent for that? I imagine he did, right?
Gerry was kind of notorious for not usually getting patents.
Oh, interesting.
Another real famous designer, Jack Stevenson, also kind of scorned patents and basically never got them. And a lot of people ripped off his designs, and he knew it. And sometimes it bothered him and sometimes not. Interesting little product that Gerry invented in the early 50s was the cord lock.
Right. Yeah.
The little nylon clamp that is everywhere. So how did he come about that? Well, it's just his inventive mind again.
Yeah. How do you create something like that in your garage in the 50s? That's what I want to know. Do you happen to know what that experience was like? Did he share a little bit about just the experience of prototyping and creating this stuff in his yard, or did he work with other people? You mentioned this blacksmith to help with the climbing equipment. Did he have someone else who was helping him, work on stuff like the clamp, the cord lock?
No, he was like Leonardo da Vinci or something. He really invented a whole bunch of stuff just sitting there in his mountain cabin, looking at a need, maybe like, I'm tired of tying little knots in this backpack to close it up. How could I do that better? Oh, a little spring, and a little block of plastic, 2 blocks, a little, I'll try this out on my drill press, and there it is.
Right. So again, just so many little inventions and things that you probably just have floating around. Maybe it's those little things that go unnoticed. Again, the industry recognized him for his influence, but day to day, I would think most people wouldn't know who. No, actually, I know most people wouldn't know where the cord lock came from. Our industry could do more to share that and share his legacy. Not saying the cord lock is Gerry's legacy, but it's a piece of it, right? Piece of that puzzle.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So kind of moving on from there, again, the breadth of what he was able to do, from inventing, new products, hardware, to, again, 2 years later after the cord lock coming out, working with that first team to climb Everest. What did you get to talk to him a little bit about that? And what was that experience like, working on product that would need to perform in some of the most extreme environments? What was that like for them? And what products did he create for that expedition?
He created their mountain tent. They had a 3-man version and a 2-man version, basically modified A-frame designs that were not only sewn with meticulous care and tons of extra reinforcements, but also incorporated wands in the sides to stiffen them up. There was even a design of a ridge pole to prevent the ends of the tent from being smashed back and forth by heavy wind. He lived in a harsh mountain environment at 8,000 feet. So all he had to do was step out his door to test out some of this stuff. And he did with his family. There were a bunch of family stories about how all the kids helped product test. And of course, once he got well known enough to have famous climbers coming by saying, yeah, we'd like to use one of your tents, then he would be getting feedback from them when they went out onto the big mountains. So it was that kind of a loop that went on for him. But he didn't have a lot of expedition products, right? Highlander became the main supplier of the expeditions in terms of things like the down gear. Highlander became known as the best down gear. Incredible expedition parkas, this thick, and down mittens like you wouldn't believe, gigantic, huge down mittens. That was something that Gerry didn't attempt to compete in.
Right. It seemed like he was focused mostly on the gear. They started to dabble in down jackets in the early 60s.
Yeah, they had some of those, yes. Mm-hmm.
But now, currently it's a very different company now than what it was. It seems like it's all purely apparel. It's kind of the current iteration of the Gerry brand, and we'll get into that a little bit as well. 58, they opened their first store in Boulder, which
it was a little later than that.
Okay, a little bit later.
It was closer to 1960.
Oh, okay.
I want to say that beyond the gear itself, I think that Gerry's key contributions were philosophies. Philosophies. And the two main ones were ultralight gear and basically the very beginning of the Leave No Trace movement. This is one of his booklets that he distributed for free all over the United States and all the stores that carried his brand. And he'd go to those stores and give talks, distributed all these things for free. This is how to camp and leave no trace. This one is really all about ultralight backpacking. They didn't have all the modern fabrics and so forth, but he believed that a family could go out into the wilderness backpacking and nobody would carry more than 20 pounds, even the leader.
Right.
And the children carried 12 to 15 pounds. And he had all the gear for that and had designed tents and so forth so that all of it came in at that kind of a weight. And his philosophy was different than hardcore climber philosophy. It was families. Let's get everybody out.
Right.
And to do that, they have to enjoy it.
Right. So around that same time, they create the Kiddy Carrier. So, backpack little frame pack that you could put your child in the back and carry him around. It's interesting that the products corresponded with these publications that he was putting out. And I agree that he was a pioneer in that way, recognizing that not everyone's going to know how to do all this stuff. People need to be educated. And I think we see that there's a way to relate that to now. We still see that. And maybe that influence has been felt, maybe not consciously by brands, but you see brands out there are trying to educate people on how to experience the outdoors. I don't know if you've seen that. And I think you could probably attribute that back to Gerry, and maybe people have come up about it other ways, but was he kind of the first to pioneer that and realize, well, I can make the gear, but if people don't know how to use it, or don't know that they can go outside, then they're not going to come buy the gear, right? And just, obviously the benefits
Mhm.
in general of just going outside.
Uh,
How to keep warm.
so if your feet are cold, put your hat on.
Yeah.
Of course, that was taught in all kind of survival schools, Boy Scouts, year after year after year and year. It's true. Well, so as you say, it's a matter of educating the public about the use of this stuff, not just cranking out down jackets.
Mm-hmm.
So this guy had many visions, and he wanted to share them with not just climbers, but families, common people. He wanted to get people out there, and he had an environmental vision as well, not just leave no trace per se, but a vision that was environmental in terms of, say, the first Earth Day. I think it was this one, How to Camp and Leave No Trace. He consciously produced this in time for the first Earth Day. This little stove.
Yeah.
There's a fuel hose here and a burner, and it all goes in this tiny little package.
Yeah.
This has been modified so it can use modern fuel canisters, but the fuel canisters that they used at the time they had stamped on them, bring me back and get whatever it was at the time, $1 refund or something. Bring them back to the Gerry store, and you're encouraged to do the right thing. So that was Gerry.
It seemed like in so many ways he innovated products, business models, just a way of thinking. I love that idea of him. The company starting. The company started focused on creating performance products, at the highest level. But he also realized not everyone's going to be the extremist, and the benefit is just getting outside, however you do it, right? And I think we see a lot of brands who are doing that today, right? And take that model of, marketing to the extremist and showing the performance, but also meeting the needs of people who just want to get out, right? And so it seems like most brands out there, modern day brands, have products for the extreme and have products for the lifestyle, or even just, the amateur or someone who just wants to get out, right?
I liked what you said about Gerry had a vision that people needed to be instructed and educated. And it's a tough challenge. It's so easy to just sell the products. I had this personal experience with my oldest son at one point. He had been at college, and suddenly he writes me an email. Oh, some friends and I want to go camping. And this is over Christmas break in the mountains of Washington. Okay, they're going to get rained on or snowed on, and the weather's going to be terrible, right?
Yeah.
So he said, I need some gear. I need to borrow some gear. So he came over, and instead of just handing him packs, sleeping bags, stoves, etc., it turned out he didn't really know how to use these things. So he started asking a few intelligent questions. Next thing you know, we spent the entire morning. And when he left, he said, how do you know all these things? And if you think about that, how do you know tie knots? How do you know all kinds of things about how to tie up a pair of boots just right? How do you know waterproofing boots? How do you know all this stuff? Well, I've been very pleased to see sometimes it's the companies, but often it's users who get on YouTube and put out actual videos saying, this is how you actually use these things, or this is how you actually stake down a tent properly in high winds. So anyway, that's a little bit of a diversion there, but
No, I think it's great. And I think, it's not always brands that are going to take that role of the educator, right? Like Gerry did. And it goes to other consumers, right? And we're seeing a lot of that where just individuals are trying to educate other people on how to get out and how to do it right. When, I guess, just for me, when did Gerry really hit its stride? When did the company start to become known to the public? It was known to the mountaineers and the extremists, and when he was working with these expeditions, kind of the extreme users. When did the company start to be known to the general public? Was it when the publications were coming out? I know that the Olympics had an influence on that, when some Gerry coats were seen nationwide on TV in '64. What helped propel the brand forward to the public, and when did it really start to gain steam?
well, now that actually was one of the key events in the company becoming more visible in public. The so-called Gerry slope coat, which was this very long garment. Looks very retro now, but yeah, and all the people on the ski committee, U.S. ski committee, were wearing them on TV. Prior to that, in the late 50s, Gerry hired a woman named Julie Johnson, no relation to me, to be a sewer for him, and she worked primarily on their mountain tents, sewing them up in her little apartment with her husband, Dale. And after a while, Dale got sort of sucked into it too. He was trained as a geologist. Gerry had an interest in teaching people how to make gear. He had been producing books, little books, maybe 50 pages long, how to make gear, how to make tents, how to make sleeping bags. And Dale felt the books weren't at all user-friendly, and he eventually went on to create Frostline kits about 6 years later. But right in there started to be new creative energy, not just so much Gerry doing everything. You had Dale Johnson, a talented designer. You had bringing in a guy named George Lamb, who had the only walking foot sewing machine, who could sew real heavy leather and things, coming in and helping out. And this guy, Dale, and also Lamb, both of those guys have big interest in clothing, and they started developing a whole line of downhill ski products, which Gerry wasn't all that interested in, but he let them do their thing. And that, of course, led to this slope coat, 1964 Olympics. And gradually, Gerry started becoming less an expedition company and more, Gerry makes downhill ski coats.
Yeah, almost more of a fashion company in a way.
And then when Gerry left the company in 1970, what was left of the company basically dropped all the climbing stuff and started just basically producing downhill ski stuff.
Right. So that we posted a picture of the 1971 catalog, and you jumped on Instagram and commented and said that was the first catalog that he wasn't a part of.
Yeah. And it was a boring looking cover.
Yeah. So why did he leave? Why did he step away?
He ran into financial difficulties right around 1966, where he had gotten kind of not really overextended. There was something that happened with a big producer that he was working with, and a big shipment, and he was in debt for it to get it, and all of a sudden his credit line got canceled, and it was just a mess, just a huge mess. And he wrote quite a bit about it in his biography. And he reluctantly got drawn into a relationship with Dick Olson, um, a guy who was very involved in the creation of Aspen. And then he was starting to get diluted because now he's a part of this entity called Colorado Outdoor Mountain Sports. And over the next few years, it got to be more of a, now he's part of like some bigger company thing. And he wasn't so sure about that. And eventually the company was expanding, and they wanted him to move into Denver and occupy a position in this outdoor sports company. And Gerry and his wife tried it. They moved into a skyscraper in Denver, and within a very short while, Gerry found it unacceptable and quit the company. He said that he'd attend meetings with people with ties, and he had his product ideas, and he felt like he wasn't getting listened to. And he just basically said, forget this noise, and left. And that was that. He never looked back.
Where did that take him down there? What time period was that? He left in the 70s. Okay. And now what did he do for the next few decades? He ended up passing away in 2010. What did he do for those next few years post Gerry life?
Yeah, it's little known, but even though he lived in the mountains of Colorado, he was always a big sailor. He had connections that were far outside of Colorado, down in the Southwest, and he moved to a position at a school in Sedona, Arizona, and after that, he got involved in the state of Arizona in an environmental program, maybe one of the first in the nation. Energy conservation was his big deal there under Bruce Babbitt, the governor, Bruce Babbitt. And he was sailing. He was always sailing once he got down there in the Gulf of Mexico.
Right.
Baja California. And he discovered a need for charts, sailing charts. And he would spend months cruising down there, creating these custom sailing charts and selling those, which became what he did.
Wow. And then 92, he was recognized by the Outdoor Industry Association. And then kind of fast forwarding, it passes away in, of all places, Patagonia, Arizona. What a name.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
Yeah. What, I guess before I touch on his legacy, to kind of wrap it up, any other influential alumni that came out of the Gerry experience or were in that circle? You mentioned Dale Johnson, went on to start Frostline Kits. Roy and Alice Holubar were kind of in that circle, around that same time in the late 40s and on. Who else was kind of in his orbit that was influenced by the company?
George Lamb went on to found a company called Alp Sport in Boulder, which then got tied into another company. I see the little Edelweiss flower, that was their brand. And then he moved out of that and had a company called Camp 7 in the early 70s. And then he eventually went into having a Western saddle making company. So those would be the main people that he influenced.
Right. What do you think Gerry thought his legacy was? A lot of these people don't think of their own legacy or their own history in those terms, but reflecting back on his time, did he share with you kind of what he thought of that whole journey and experience and starting this company and his influence? Did he fully recognized the impact that he had. What were his thoughts on his time and his work?
By the time that I was talking to him in 2006, up through the end, he had moved so far past all of that it was like ancient history to him.
Mm.
He valued it, but he didn't have a big ego. He never did. Thinking of himself as some great pioneer who'd done all these great things, that just was not him. So I would have to say that even though he came out of gear retirement, you might say, to do the 1992 thing, he was out of it. He just was out of it. He knew he'd done some valuable things, and he had moved out of it. He wasn't, by the time I was talking to him, he wasn't a backpacker anymore. He wasn't a climber anymore. He was a sailor. He lived in a solar home that he had built himself up in the mountains there, and that is how I would have to characterize him.
Right. Regarding the company itself, he sold it in 70. It looks like it changed hands a couple of different times, between a few different parent companies, Outdoor
Yes.
Sports Industries, and then Amorex Group. And now, interestingly enough, the brand has been revived. Imagine at a time there, it had kind of just disappeared in the 2000s. And then it's been revived in 2010, under a studio out of New York, Studio Ray, looks like, and they've revived the brand.
Studio Ray. Yeah, and I helped them develop their timeline of Gerry. Yeah, they have attempted to find a niche for the brand, and what they've got out of it apparently is a brand of basically down jackets made in Asia. And it's good to see Gerry back. There were other efforts to revive it. There was a Swedish company that turned out stuff under the Gerry label for a while, maybe bootleg, I don't know. We'll talk more in a later podcast about the Highlander brand, which I think the revival of that has been much more substantial and much more kind of worth following.
Right. That whole question of brand revivals is really interesting, especially as we talked in the last podcast. There's so many of these trademarks, so many of these beloved brands that, eventually the founder's no longer a part of the company, and the brand disappears, and those trademarks are floating around there, somewhere. And I'm glad that there's people like the team behind Holy Bar and Gerry. It's good to at least see the name back out there, even if the company doesn't necessarily, isn't, maybe as true to the heritage or doing the same things that they were doing in the past. It's at least nice to see the brand around, and hopefully those brands can honor that legacy.
Well, both of them, Gerry and Highlander, have made a big effort to try to honor their heritage.
So just to kind of wrap up, what would you say are the lasting impacts of Gerry mountain equipment?
In the history book of gear development, there are so many really substantial things. Obviously, most of the designs, like the tents and sleeping bags and so forth that he did, they've all been surpassed now by modern designs, new fabrics and so forth. seam sealing techniques that didn't exist. But to me, the lasting things are his commitment to a philosophy: leave no trace, get out and enjoy it as a family, appreciate the wilderness, preserve it. Those are the things that I see as his main lasting and really important legacies.
Right. No, that's great. Do you have any other final thoughts? Anything that you feel like we missed that we ought to mention about the company, about the history, about Gerry as a person? Anything that we didn't touch on that you want to include?
No, just really to refine the point about how Gerry left his company. As I indicated, starting in about 1966, he sort of got sucked into, you might say, the corporate world and being beholden to kind of an owner. And for him, that led to him giving it up, right? In other companies that we might discuss in the future, the move was also terrible.
Mm.
And in a few, it was successful. So
right.
We'll talk more about those in future episodes.
Yeah, there's kind of a pattern there. It would be interesting to compare, which companies succeeded by doing that and which ones did not. If someone wants to learn more about Gerry, you mentioned a biography that's out there that he wrote.
It's not out there.
Oh,
it's not out there.
Okay.
No. Let's see here. Gerry sent me this about 2007. It's a PDF biography that he and his two boys put together, and it has a ton of stuff that isn't related directly to his gear. There are very important sections about the company and so forth too, but it's full of pictures. Gerry was a historian. I think his father in the photography business had taught him. He always took pictures. He always archived his pictures. He had a full selection of the history in pictures and also in words and documents. So that of course allowed me to do the job that I could do because he had been so good with that.
Right. So if people do want to learn more about Gerry, about the company, about the history, we'll link to the piece that you wrote on the History of Gear website to the Gerry, the new iteration of the company. They've got a great timeline that you helped create. We'll link to that as well. But it's great to dive into this history. It's nice to learn about someone so influential that maybe people even in this industry don't really recognize the impacts, the lasting impacts of this person and this company. So I appreciate you doing the work and spending the time sharing what you've spent the time to learn with all of us. So thanks again for taking time to do this.
You're welcome.